hope it goes away. Because in those times, one wrong decision could change your life forever. Stay with me till the end, because what really happened next might surprise you. And if you enjoy this kind of mysterious storytelling, don't forget to subscribe and comment where you're watching from. In the deep stillness of a medieval night, when darkness swallowed the narrow lanes, and only the faint glow of hearth fires flickered behind shuttered windows, a knock at the door was not a simple or ordinary occurrence, but a moment that could stir immediate fear, suspicion, or reluctant curiosity, because nighttime itself belonged to uncertainty, danger, and forces both human and imagined. Most people lived by the rhythm of daylight, retreating indoors as soon as the sun dipped below the horizon, securing wooden doors with heavy bars and bolts, sometimes even placing furniture against them, knowing that after dark the world beyond their threshold changed entirely. And so when a sudden knock echoed through the quiet, it cut sharply through the silence like a warning, forcing those inside to freeze and listen, hearts pounding as they tried to determine whether it was real or imagined. A trick of wind, a branch brushing against wood, or something far more deliberate and threatening. The first instinct was rarely to open the door, because medieval society was shaped by caution. Strangers were not easily trusted, especially at night when identity could not be clearly seen, and intentions were easily concealed, and the possibilities were numerous and unsettling, ranging from a lost traveller seeking shelter to a desperate beggar, from a wounded messenger bearing urgent news to a bandit testing whether a house was occupied and vulnerable. And in regions plagued by conflict or unrest, it could even signal soldiers, tax collectors, or agents of authority, whose arrival rarely brought comfort. Thus, the knock carried layers of meaning, each more concerning than the last. And people inside would often remain silent at first, hoping the visitor might leave, while straining to catch any additional sound. Footsteps shifting, voices whispering, or the creak of leather and metal that might reveal the nature of the caller. If the knocking persisted, louder or more insistent, it created a psychological tension that was difficult to ignore. And someone within the household, usually the head of the family or the bravest member, would cautiously approach the door, sometimes holding a candle or oil lamp, whose dim light barely reached the threshold, and instead of opening immediately, they might speak through the wood, asking who was there, their voice guarded and firm, expecting an answer that could either reassure or deepen their fear. Yet even a spoken reply did not guarantee safety, because voices could deceive, and stories of trickery were not uncommon, where thieves or attackers would feign distress, pretending to be injured or in need of help to lure occupants into lowering their guard. And so the decision to open the door was never taken lightly, as it involved balancing the moral expectation of offering aid, deeply rooted in religious teachings about charity and hospitality, against the very real risk of harm or loss. In many cases, especially in rural areas where communities were small and people knew each other well, a knock might indeed come from a neighbour in need, perhaps calling for assistance during illness, childbirth, or emergency, and in such situations the door would eventually be opened, though still with caution, sometimes only partially, with a chain or bar held in place to prevent it from being forced open, and the visitor would be quickly assessed in the flickering light, their face scrutinized, clothing examined for signs of familiarity or threat. But in towns and cities, where anonymity was more common and crime more frequent, the response tended to be far more guarded, and many would choose not to open at all, instead waiting until morning to deal with whatever business had come knocking in the night. Beyond the practical dangers, there was also a layer of superstition that shaped how such moments were perceived. Because medieval people lived in a world where the boundary between the natural and supernatural was often blurred, and unexplained sounds in the darkness could be attributed to spirits, omens, or otherworldly forces. So a knock without a clear voice or presence might not be answered at all, out of fear that it could invite misfortune or something unseen into the home. And tales circulated of phantom knocks, ghostly visitors, or warnings from beyond, which only heightened the unease surrounding such an event. Even the wind itself, rattling doors or shutters, could be interpreted as something more sinister when experienced in the heavy silence of night. The structure of medieval homes also played a role in how these encounters unfolded. As doors were often thick and reinforced, but not always secure by modern standards, and windows were small, sometimes without glass, covered instead with shutters or cloth, limiting visibility and making it difficult to identify a visitor without opening up, which increased the sense of vulnerability. And in some cases, households might respond to persistent knocking by arming themselves, grabbing tools, knives, or whatever could serve as protection, before even considering engagement, especially if the knock was accompanied by suspicious sounds or multiple voices outside. If the visitor turned out to be someone of authority, such as a messenger carrying news from a lord or official, refusing to open the door could bring consequences, which added another layer of pressure to the decision, as people had to weigh not only immediate safety, but also potential repercussions of ignoring a legitimate summons. And this uncertainty meant that each knock carried a unique tension shaped by context, location, and the experiences of those inside. In some rare and fortunate instances, the knock might bring welcome news. A returning family member, a friend arriving late from travel, or word of opportunity. But such positive outcomes were overshadowed by the prevailing reality that night belonged to risk, and anything that disrupted its quiet order demanded caution. Ultimately, hearing a knock at your door in medieval times was not a trivial interruption, but a moment charged with uncertainty and consequence, where instinct, fear, morality and survival all collided in the space of a few seconds, and the simple act of deciding whether to open the door could mean the difference between offering help, avoiding danger, or inviting it inside, making that sound sharp, unexpected, and echoing through the darkness. One of the most unsettling experiences of life in a world where safety ended at the threshold, and the night concealed far more than it revealed. And if the knocking did not stop, if it came again, slower this time, heavier, more deliberate, it could feel less like a request and more like a test, as though whoever stood outside was measuring patience, gauging fear, waiting for the moment when hesitation inside might turn into action. And in that tense stretch of time the household would often fall into a hushed, almost breathless silence, each person listening not just to the door but to one another, exchanging glances in the dim glow of firelight, silently asking what should be done. because every second that passed without a decision seemed to increase the weight of the unknown pressing against the wooden barrier that separated safety from whatever lingered beyond. Sometimes the knock would be followed by a voice, but not always a clear or comforting one. It might be low and hurried, as if the speaker did not wish to be heard by others, or strained and uneven, suggesting injury or exhaustion. And yet even then, doubt would remain because deception was a known danger, and people were aware that urgency could be mimicked, that desperation could be acted, and so even a plea for help might be met with suspicion rather than immediate compassion, creating a painful conflict between the instinct to protect oneself and the moral duty to aid those in distress, a conflict that defined many such moments in medieval life. In wealthier households or those with servants, the responsibility of answering the door might fall to someone designated for such tasks. But that did not lessen the risk. In fact, it sometimes placed the servant in greater danger, as they were expected to approach first, to speak through the door, to interpret the situation quickly, and decide whether to involve the master of the house, and their judgment could have serious consequences, not only for themselves but for everyone inside, which meant that even a simple knock could ripple through the hierarchy of the household, creating tension and urgency that spread from one person to another. In certain regions, especially those prone to raids or travelling bands of outlaws, a knock at night could immediately trigger defensive behaviour, with multiple members of the household preparing to respond as a group, positioning themselves strategically, some near the door, others near exits or windows, ready to react if the situation turned violent, because it was understood that a single knock could be a distraction, a way to draw attention, while others attempted to enter from a different side. And so awareness had to extend beyond the door itself to the entire perimeter of the home, turning a moment of uncertainty into a heightened state of alertness. There were also times when the knocking would come and then suddenly stop, leaving behind an even deeper silence that felt heavier than before, because now there was no sound to interpret, no clear indication of whether the visitor had left or was simply waiting quietly, perhaps listening in return. And this absence of noise could be more unsettling than the knocking itself, prompting some to remain awake for hours afterward, too uneasy to sleep, replaying the event in their minds and wondering whether they had avoided danger or merely delayed it. In colder seasons, when nights were longer and harsher, the decision carried additional weight. There were also nights when the knock came in patterns that felt almost intentional, not frantic or desperate, but measured, spaced apart as if guided by patience rather than urgency. And that alone could be deeply unsettling, because it suggested that whoever stood outside was not acting out of panic, but with a certain calm awareness, perhaps even confidence. And this shifted the emotional weight inside the house from sympathy to unease, as people began to wonder whether they were being watched, whether their silence, their whispers, even the flicker of their candlelight, was somehow visible through cracks in the shutters or gaps beneath the door. In such moments, the house itself seemed to change, no longer just a place of shelter, but a fragile boundary under quiet pressure. Every creak of wood or settling beam suddenly amplified, every shadow cast by the fire appearing to move with intention, feeding the imagination and making it difficult to separate reality from fear. Someone might slowly edge closer to the door again, not to open it, but to listen more closely, placing an ear against the rough timber, trying to detect breathing or movement on the other side. and sometimes there would be nothing at all, just an empty stillness that raised even more questions, because a presence that made no sound could feel more threatening than one that did. In certain regions, it was believed that not all knocks came from the living, and while such beliefs might sound distant now, they carried real influence in shaping how people reacted. A knock that came without a voice, or one that was followed by silence when questioned, might be interpreted as a warning rather than a request, a sign of misfortune, or an omen that something had already gone wrong somewhere nearby. And so instead of opening the door, some would turn to quiet rituals, whispered prayers, protective symbols traced in ash or oil, or simply waiting in stillness until the first signs of dawn broke the tension. Because in a world where explanations were limited and danger was often invisible, caution extended beyond the physical into the spiritual. Even those who were less inclined to superstition could not entirely escape the psychological effect of the night, because darkness itself created uncertainty, and uncertainty invited the mind to fill in gaps with possibilities that felt just as real as anything seen in daylight. If the knocking eventually turned into pounding, louder and more forceful, the situation could escalate quickly, transforming hesitation into urgency. And at that point, the household might abandon any thought of dialogue, focusing instead on defense, bracing the door more firmly, gathering whatever could be used as protection, and preparing for the possibility that the barrier might not hold, because doors, no matter how solid, were not invincible. And the sound of repeated impact could send a clear message that the person outside was no longer asking for entry, but attempting to take it. In such cases, the night could stretch unbearably long, every minute filled with anticipation, every sound outside scrutinized for signs of escalation or retreat, until eventually the noise either ceased or was replaced by something else. Footsteps fading into the distance, voices calling out, or in the worst cases, the splintering of wood that signaled the beginning of a confrontation no one inside had truly wanted to face. Yet not every knock ended in fear or danger. There were also moments when the door, once cautiously opened, revealed something entirely different from what had been imagined. A traveller worn down by the road, a messenger carrying news that could not wait until morning, or even a familiar face delayed by circumstance. And in those instances, the tension that had filled the room would slowly dissolve, replaced by relief, conversation, and the quiet realization of how quickly the mind had turned uncertainty into dread. But even these more positive outcomes did not erase the underlying caution, because each experience reinforced the idea that the night was unpredictable, that every knock carried the potential to be something else, something unexpected, and that the only certainty was the need to remain alert. Over time, these repeated encounters, whether real, imagined, or somewhere in between, became part of the collective understanding of life after dark, shaping not only individual reactions, but also the broader habits of communities, encouraging people to rely on each other during daylight, to settle matters before nightfall, and to treat any disturbance after dark as something that required careful consideration rather than immediate response. Doors were not just physical barriers, but symbols of that boundary, and the act of keeping them closed during the night was as much about preserving peace of mind as it was about ensuring safety. So when a knock came in the quiet hours, it did more than simply interrupt sleep. It introduced a question that could not be easily answered, a moment that forced those inside to confront both the external uncertainty of the world beyond their door and the internal uncertainty of their own judgment, weighing fear against responsibility, caution against compassion, and silence against action, all within the span of a few heartbeats. And even after the night had passed and the sun had risen, that moment would linger, not just as a memory of a sound in the dark, but as a reminder of how fragile the sense of security could be, how quickly it could be challenged by something as simple and ordinary as a knock, and how, in the medieval world, even the smallest disturbance could carry with it a depth of meaning that reached far beyond the door itself. In some cases, the knock would come not just once, but return over several nights, and that repetition could be even more unsettling than a single disturbance, because it suggested persistence, intention, and perhaps a knowledge of the household's routines, as if whoever or whatever stood outside was learning, waiting, testing the limits of patience and fear. And this pattern could slowly wear down even the most cautious occupants, turning initial resistance into anxious anticipation, where every evening was spent wondering if the sound would return, if the silence would be broken again at the same hour, in the same measured rhythm, until the night itself began to feel like a stage set for that inevitable interruption. People might begin preparing for it before it even happened, ensuring doors were secured earlier than usual, keeping lamps lit longer, or choosing to stay awake in shifts, listening for the first sign of that familiar dreaded sound, because the unpredictability of the knock was often more disturbing than the knock itself. There were also moments when the knocking would be accompanied by subtle attempts to provoke a reaction, perhaps a faint call of a name, spoken just loud enough to be heard inside, or the sound of something lightly brushing against the door, as though to suggest presence without fully revealing it. And these small details could create a deep sense of unease, because they implied awareness, a connection between inside and outside that felt too close for comfort, as if the barrier of the door was not as complete as it seemed. In such situations, even the bravest individuals might hesitate, caught between the urge to confront the source of the disturbance and the instinct to remain hidden, to deny whatever waited outside the acknowledgement it seemed to seek. For those living on the edges of towns or in isolated rural dwellings, the experience could be even more intense, because there were fewer neighbours to call upon, fewer witnesses to share the burden of decision, and the surrounding darkness was often deeper and more complete, stretching out across fields, forests, or unlit roads where anything could approach unseen. And so a knock in such a place carried a heavier weight, a stronger sense of vulnerability, as though the house itself stood alone against whatever might emerge from that vast silent expanse. In these settings, people often relied more heavily on instinct and experience, reading into the smallest clues, the timing of the knock, the strength behind it, the presence or absence of accompanying sounds, in an attempt to make sense of something that offered very little information. Sometimes, the response to a knock was not immediate action, but deliberate stillness, a choice to remain quiet and observe, to let the moment pass without engagement. And this silence could itself become a form of communication, signalling to the outside that the household was either unwilling or unable to respond. And depending on the intentions of the visitor, this could either discourage further attempts or provoke them, creating a delicate balance where even doing nothing had consequences. The people inside would listen closely for changes, the shift of weight on the ground outside, the faint crunch of footsteps moving away, or the lingering absence of any sound at all, and each possibility carried its own interpretation, its own implications for what might happen next. In certain rare accounts, the knock would come from an unexpected place. Not the front door, but a side entrance, a shuttered window, or even a wall, challenging the assumption of where a visitor should appear, and adding another layer of confusion to the situation because it disrupted the normal patterns of interaction, suggesting either unfamiliarity with the household or an attempt to avoid detection. And this unpredictability could heighten fear, making it harder to decide how to respond as the usual rules no longer seem to apply. The idea that someone might be moving around the outside of the house, choosing different points of contact, could make the entire structure feel exposed, as though it were being encircled rather than simply approached. And there were nights when the knock seemed to arrive at the exact moment when the household had finally surrendered to sleep, when the fire had burned low, when breathing had settled into slow, steady rhythms, and dreams had just begun to take shape, only for that sudden, hollow sound against wood to pull everyone back into wakefulness with a joe. Felt disorienting and immediate, as if the night itself had reached in and shaken them awake. And in those first few seconds, confusion often mixed with fear, because the mind, still half in dreams, struggled to make sense of what was real, what was imagined, and whether the sound had truly come from outside or from somewhere within the fragile boundary between sleep and waking. In that state, even a single knock could feel louder, more significant, echoing not just through the room but through the mind, expanding into something far greater than the simple action that caused it. Sometimes no one would move at all at first, as if stillness itself might make the situation disappear. Each person waiting for someone else to act, to speak, to take responsibility for whatever decision would come next. And this shared hesitation could stretch on, creating a quiet tension that filled the space more completely than any noise, because it carried with it the weight of uncertainty and the knowledge that whatever choice was made could not easily be undone. Eventually someone might sit up, listening carefully, counting the seconds between sounds, trying to determine whether the knock would return, whether it had been a single occurrence or the beginning of something more persistent. And this act of listening became almost as important as the knock itself, a way of gathering information in a situation where information was scarce. In households with children, the atmosphere could become even more charged, as younger members, less able to control their fear or curiosity, might whisper questions, seek reassurance, or cling to those around them. And the adults, even if uncertain themselves, would often try to maintain a sense of calm, lowering their voices, urging silence, projecting confidence they might not fully feel, because maintaining composure was part of maintaining control. And in a world where so much lay beyond that control, even small gestures of steadiness could make a difference in how the moment unfolded. There were also instances when the knock would be followed by a pause so long that it seemed as though the visitor had gone, only for it to return again suddenly, breaking the fragile sense of relief that had begun to form. And this pattern, sound, silence, sound again, could create a kind of rhythm that kept the household suspended between action and inaction, never fully resolving the situation, never allowing it to settle into certainty. Each return of the knock forced the same questions to be asked again, the same risks to be weighed, and the repetition could make the experience feel almost endless, as though the night itself had become an extension of that moment. In some rare cases, someone might decide to confront the situation more directly, stepping outside rather than opening the door inward, choosing to meet the unknown on equal ground rather than from behind a barrier. And while this could provide clarity more quickly, it also carried its own risks, as stepping into the darkness meant leaving behind the relative safety of the home, and entering a space where visibility was limited and control was reduced. And such decisions were often driven as much by frustration or determination as by courage, a desire to end the uncertainty, even if it meant facing whatever lay beyond the threshold. There were also practical considerations that influenced how the situation was handled, such as the time of year, the condition of the household, and the recent experiences of the community. A village that had recently faced theft or violence would respond very differently from one that had not, just as a household that had previously helped a stranger in need might be more inclined to do so again, or perhaps more cautious if that past experience had not ended well. In this way, each knock was not just an isolated event, but part of a larger pattern of memory and expectation shaped by what had come before and influencing what would come after. And then there was the lingering aftermath, the way the memory of the knock would remain even after the night had ended, discussed in quiet conversations the next morning, analysed and reanalysed as people tried to make sense of it, to decide whether their response had been the right one, whether they had avoided danger or missed an opportunity to help. And these reflections could subtly alter future behaviour, making people more cautious, more attentive, or in some cases more willing to act, depending on how the experience was interpreted. Over time, these small moments accumulated, forming a kind of unwritten knowledge about how to navigate the uncertainties of the night. So a knock at the door in medieval times was never confined to the instant in which it occurred. It stretched backward into memory and forward into consequence, touching not just the physical act of answering or ignoring it, but the emotional and psychological landscape of those who heard it, shaping how they thought about safety, trust, and the unknown. It was a simple sound, easily produced, easily repeated, yet capable of carrying immense weight. Because in the quiet, shadowed world of the medieval night, where light was scarce and certainty even scarcer, even the smallest interruption could open the door. Not just literally, but figuratively, to a range of possibilities that extended far beyond what could be seen or understood in that moment, leaving behind an impression that lingered long after the echoes had faded into silence. There were even moments when the knock seemed to carry a strange familiarity, as though it followed a rhythm the listener almost recognized, not quite belonging to any known person, yet not entirely foreign either. And this ambiguity could be deeply unsettling, because it stirred a sense of memory without clarity, making those inside question whether they had heard such a pattern before, whether it reminded them of a friend, a relative, or someone long absent. And this faint recognition could tempt them toward the door despite their caution, drawing them closer with a quiet pull that was difficult to explain. Yet even as that pull grew, doubt remained close behind, whispering that familiarity could be misleading, that the mind, especially in the stillness of night, could shape sounds into something meaningful, even when they were not. And so the tension between recognition and suspicion became another layer in an already complex moment. At times, The night might be accompanied by the sound of whir, rain tapping steadily against the roof, wind pressing against the walls, or distant thunder rolling across the sky. And these natural elements could blur the boundaries between what was intentional and what was accidental, making it harder to determine whether the sound at the door was caused by a person or by the restless movements of the night itself. In such conditions, every noise seemed to overlap, to echo and distort, creating an environment where certainty was nearly impossible, and where decisions had to be made, based not on clear evidence, but on instinct and interpretation. A knock heard through the rush of wind might feel more urgent, more desperate, even if it was no different from one heard in calm weather, simply because the surrounding sounds amplified its presence. There were also situations where the knock came too softly, so faint that it might be missed entirely if not for a moment of wakefulness or a particularly attentive ear. And this subtlety could be just as unnerving as a loud, insistent pounding, because it suggested a kind of restraint, a deliberate choice to remain quiet, to avoid drawing attention, and that in itself raised questions about intent, as those inside wondered why someone would approach in such a careful, almost secretive way. A soft knock might be repeated once or twice, barely audible, as if testing whether anyone was awake, whether anyone would notice. And this quiet persistence could create a different kind of tension, one that was less immediate but more lingering, like a question that remained unanswered. In some cases, people might attempt to observe the outside without opening the door, peering through narrow cracks, lifting a shutter slightly, or positioning a light in such a way that it illuminated the area just beyond the threshold. But these efforts often revealed very little, as the darkness beyond could swallow detail, reducing shapes to vague outlines and movements to indistinct shadows. And this limited visibility could make any figure appear more threatening than it truly was, transforming ordinary features into something unfamiliar, something harder to trust. A person standing quietly outside might seem motionless and unreadable, their face obscured, their intentions hidden, and this lack of clarity could reinforce the decision to remain closed off, to keep the boundary intact. There were also times when the knock would come from someone known, but at an unusual hour, and this disruption of expectation could be just as alarming as a stranger's presence, because it suggested that something out of the ordinary had occurred, that the person outside was driven by urgency or necessity, and this could prompt a quicker response, though not necessarily a less cautious one, as familiarity did not eliminate risk, but merely shifted the nature of it. The door might be opened more readily in such cases, but still with care, still with awareness that even known faces could carry unexpected news or consequences. There were also nights when the knock seemed almost hesitant, as if whoever stood outside was unsure of their own purpose, tapping lightly, then pausing for long stretches, then returning again with slightly more confidence. And this uneven rhythm could be strangely unsettling because it suggested a mind at work beyond the door, someone thinking, reconsidering, perhaps even listening in return, and that sense of a shared awareness, of two sides quietly observing each other through a barrier, could make the moment feel far more intimate and tense than a loud, forceful demand ever could. Inside, people might lower their voices even further, instinctively trying not to reveal too much, as though silence itself could act as protection, as though not being heard might somehow prevent being understood. In some instances, the knock might come from someone who had no intention of entering at all, but rather of confirming something. Whether the house was occupied, whether anyone was awake, whether there was movement inside, and this possibility introduced another layer of unease, because it meant the knock was not the goal, but a means, a way of gathering information, and the response, or lack of response, could influence what happened next, turning even the smallest sound made inside into a signal that might be interpreted and acted upon. A creaking floorboard, a whispered exchange, the faint glow of a light shifting behind a shutter. Any of these could betray presence, could answer a question that had not been spoken aloud. There were also moments when the knock would come at an hour so late that it seemed disconnected from ordinary human activity, a time when even the most restless travellers would have sought shelter, and when the world outside should have been at its most still. And this timing alone could heighten suspicion, making the sound feel out of place, almost unnatural, as if it did not belong to the same rhythm as the rest of life. In such cases, people might hesitate even longer, waiting not just for another knock, but for some sign that could place the event within a familiar context, something that could explain why anyone would be outside at such an hour. Occasionally, the response to a knock would involve more than just those inside a single house. In closely built communities, neighbours might also hear the sound, might become aware that something unusual was happening, and this shared awareness could influence how the situation unfolded as people listened, not only for the knock, but for signs of reaction from nearby homes, for voices, for movement, for any indication that others were awake and alert. And this subtle network of attention could create a sense of collective vigilance, where the actions of one household were quietly observed and sometimes supported by others. Even if no direct interaction took place, there were also rare and unsettling moments when the knock would be followed by a different kind of sound altogether. Perhaps a slow dragging along the surface of the door, or a faint tapping that moved from one part of the wood to another, as if tracing its edges. And such details could transform the experience into something far more disturbing, because they suggested not just presence, but movement, exploration, and awareness of the barrier itself. And this could make the door feel less like a solid protection and more like something being examined, something that might be tested further if no response was given. In some households, particularly those that had experienced previous incidents, there might be established ways of responding, small routines developed over time to manage such situations. Whether it was always asking the same set of questions before opening, always waiting a certain amount of time, or always ensuring that more than one person was present when the door was approached. And these habits provided a sense of structure in moments that otherwise felt unpredictable, a way of imposing order on uncertainty, even if that order could not fully eliminate the risks involved. And then there were the nights when the knock, once it stopped, lagged behind a silence so complete that it seemed almost deliberate, as if the absence of sound itself was part of the experience. And in that silence, every thought seemed louder, every possibility more vivid, until the mind itself became the source of tension, replaying the event again and again, imagining outcomes that had not occurred, questioning decisions that had already been made. And this internal echo could last far longer than the actual sound, extending the moment into something that lingered well beyond its physical duration. So the knock at the door, simple in form yet complex in meaning, was never confined to a single interpretation or a single outcome. It was shaped by countless variables: time, place, memory, belief, experience, and each instance carried its own unique weight, its own set of possibilities, turning what might seem like a small interruption into a moment of profound uncertainty, where the line between safety and risk, between known and unknown, was drawn not just by the thickness of the door, but by the choices of those who stood behind it, listening, waiting, and deciding what to do next in a world where even the quietest sound could carry the loudest implications. There were even times when the knock seemed to carry a kind of quiet persistence that refused to be ignored. Not loud enough to force action, not soft enough to dismiss, but balanced somewhere in between, returning again and again with the same steady rhythm, as though it were patiently waiting for acknowledgement. And this persistence could slowly erode resistance inside, not through fear alone, but through the simple weight of repetition, wearing down the resolve to remain still, to remain silent, until the question of whether to respond became harder to avoid than the risk of answering. In that slow passage of time, the mind would begin to wander through possibilities, constructing images of who might be outside, imagining faces, intentions, outcomes, each one different, each one equally uncertain, until the knock itself became less of a sound and more of a presence, something that occupied the space just beyond the door and refused to fade. Sometimes the knocking would come in uneven intervals, breaking any sense of pattern, arriving suddenly after long stretches of silence, then repeating quickly before falling quiet again. And this unpredictability could be deeply unsettling, because it offered no rhythm to anticipate, no structure to rely on, leaving those inside in a constant state of readiness, never fully able to relax, never fully certain that the moment had passed. Each new knock would feel like a fresh beginning, resetting the tension, forcing the same cycle of listening, wondering, deciding, over and over again, until the night itself seemed stretched around that single, recurring interruption. In certain situations, the presence outside might make itself known without words, through the faintest indications: a shadow shifting under the door, a subtle change in the air, the sense that someone stood just beyond reach. And these minimal signs could be more powerful than any clear signal, because they left so much to interpretation, allowing imagination to fill in the gaps, to create something far larger and more complex than what might actually be there. A shadow could suggest stillness or movement, a presence or an absence, and without confirmation, the mind would often lean toward the more cautious, more fearful interpretation, reinforcing the instinct to remain behind the barrier. There were also moments when the knock would coincide with other distant sounds. The echo of footsteps far away, the faint call of voices carried by the wind, or the distant clatter of something unseen. And these overlapping noises could create a sense that the event was part of something larger, something happening beyond the immediate surroundings. And this broader context could either heighten concern or provide a strange kind of reassurance, depending on how it was interpreted. If the sound suggested activity elsewhere, it might mean the visitor was not alone. If they suggested distance, it might mean the knock was an isolated incident, less connected to any wider threat. In households, where previous knocks had led to known outcomes, whether good or bad. Those memories would quietly guide the present moment, influencing not just what people thought, but how quickly they acted, how firmly they held back, or how cautiously they approached, because experience had a way of shaping instinct, turning past events into silent advisors that spoke in moments of uncertainty. A door once opened without consequence might be opened again more readily. A door once opened to danger might remain closed far longer, even in situations that seemed different, because the memory of risk lingered more strongly than the possibility of safety. And there were nights when the knock would come and go so quickly that it left behind doubt rather than certainty. A fleeting sound that might have been real or might have been imagined. And in those cases, the uncertainty itself became the focus. As people questioned what they had heard, whether it had meaning, whether it required action at all. And this ambiguity could be just as powerful as a clear event, because it lingered without resolution, leaving the mind to circle around it long after the moment had passed. In the end, the experience of hearing a knock at the door in the medieval night was defined not by a single outcome, but by a continuous unfolding of possibilities, each shaped by perception, by environment, by memory, and by the quiet, persistent tension between what was known and what was not. The door stood as the dividing line, solid yet symbolic, separating the certainty of the interior from the uncertainty of the exterior. There were also nights when the knock seemed to arrive with an almost delicate precision, neither hurried nor hesitant, but placed exactly as if it were meant to be heard and nothing more. And this careful balance could make it feel intentional in a way that was difficult to ignore, as though whoever stood outside understood the weight of the moment and chose not to disturb it more than necessary. Inside, that restraint could create an equally careful response, where movements were slowed, thoughts were measured, and even the act of listening became more focused, more deliberate, as if matching the tone set by the sound itself. At times, the knock might seem to blend with the rhythm of one's own heartbeat, especially in the quiet of the night, when internal sounds became more noticeable. And this merging could create a strange sense of connection between the listener and the event, as though the boundary between inside and outside had momentarily softened, allowing the external sound to align with something internal. In that moment, it might feel less like something happening to the house, and more like something happening to the self, an experience that was both external and deeply personal at once. There were also instances when the knock would feel almost like a continuation of something unfinished, as if it followed a thought, a dream, or a memory that had been interrupted. And this continuity could give it a sense of meaning that extended beyond the immediate situation, making it seem as though it belonged to a larger narrative, one that could not be fully understood in that moment, but still carried a quiet significance. The mind, searching for patterns, might link the sound to something recent or something long past, weaving it into a story that gave it context, even if that context remained uncertain. In certain moments, the act of not responding could take on a kind of quiet strength, a deliberate choice to maintain the boundary, to allow the unknown to remain outside. And this choice could feel as active as any decision to open the door, requiring its own form of resolve, its own acceptance of whatever consequences might follow. The silence inside, held intentionally, became a statement in itself, a way of asserting control in a situation where so much lay beyond it. There were also nights when the knock would seem to lose its urgency over time, not because it changed, but because the perception of it shifted, as the initial sharpness softened into something more distant, more manageable, as though the mind had adapted to its presence, absorbing it into the background of the night rather than allowing it to dominate attention. This gradual easing could create a sense of quiet resilience, a recognition that not every disturbance required immediate resolution, that some could simply be endured until they passed. Sometimes, after the final echo had faded, there would be a lingering awareness of the door itself, of its presence as more than just a physical object, but as a boundary that had been acknowledged, tested, and held. And this awareness could remain for some time, shaping how the space was felt, how movement within it was carried out, as though the door had briefly taken on a greater significance before returning to its ordinary role. And then, as the night continued, and the world slowly returned to its usual stillness, the experience would settle into a quieter form, no longer immediate, but not entirely gone, becoming part of the subtle background of memory, something that could be recalled later with clarity or with uncertainty, depending on how it had been perceived. The knock itself might be remembered differently each time, its details shifting slightly with each recollection, but the feeling it created, the pause, the awareness, the moment of choice, would remain consistent, a small but lasting imprint of an encounter with the unknown. So the knock at the door, simple in action yet vast in implication, became a moment that extended beyond itself, touching not only the physical space of the house, but the inner space of thought and perception, creating an experience that was as much about interpretation as it was about reality. And in that quiet intersection, where sound met silence and certainty met possibility, the knock found its true significance, not in what it revealed, but in what it asked, and in how those who heard it chose to respond, carrying that choice with them long after the night had passed, and the door stood once again undisturbed. There were also moments when the knock seemed to arrive with a kind of quiet finality, as though it marked a point from which the night could not return to what it had been before. And this sense of change could settle gently but firmly over the household, altering the way everything was perceived afterward. The same walls, the same shadows, the same flicker of light would now feel slightly different, not because they had changed, but because the awareness of them had deepened, sharpened by the interruption that had briefly drawn all attention to the boundary between inside and outside. At times, the knock might feel as though it carried a presence that extended beyond the moment itself, something that lingered even in its absence, as if the act of knocking had left behind a trace, a subtle impression that remained in the air, shaping how the silence that followed was experienced. This lingering quality could make the quiet feel less empty, more watchful, as though the night had taken on a new dimension, one in which the possibility of another interruption remained just beneath the surface. There were also instances when the knock would seem to invite reflection rather than action, drawing attention inward instead of outward, prompting those who heard it to consider not just what lay beyond the door, but what it meant to be inside, to be sheltered, to be separate from whatever existed outside. In this way, the moment became more than a practical decision. It became an awareness of contrast, of the difference between the known and the unknown, between safety and uncertainty. And this awareness could linger quietly, shaping thought in ways that extended beyond the immediate situation. In certain moments, the act of listening itself became the central experience, more important than the knock that had initiated it, as the mind focused on the smallest details, the texture of the silence, the faintest shifts in sound, the subtle changes in the environment. And this heightened attention could transform the ordinary into something more vivid, more present, as though the world had been briefly brought into sharper focus by the need to understand what had happened. There were also nights when the knock would feel almost like a question left unanswered, not because it demanded a response, but because it introduced a possibility that was never resolved, leaving behind a sense of openness, of something incomplete that continued to exist in thought even after the moment had passed. This incompleteness could become part of the memory, shaping how the event was remembered, not as a closed experience, but as something that remained slightly beyond reach, inviting reconsideration each time it was recalled. Sometimes the presence beyond the door would be imagined not as something fixed, but as something shifting, undefined, changing with each passing second. And this fluidity could make it difficult to settle on any single interpretation, keeping the mind in motion, exploring possibilities without arriving at certainty. In this way, the knock became a starting point rather than a conclusion, opening a space for thought that extended far beyond the physical event. And then, as the night slowly moved forward, and the memory of the knock began to soften, there would remain a subtle change in how the darkness itself was perceived. No longer just a backdrop to rest, but a space that had briefly revealed its unpredictability, its capacity to interrupt, to reach in and alter the course of a quiet moment. This realization, though gentle, could stay with those who experienced it, influencing how future nights were approached, how silence was interpreted, how boundaries were understood. So the knock, in all its simplicity, became something that extended beyond sound and into meaning, beyond the physical and into the reflective, creating a moment that touched both the outer world and the inner one, leaving behind not just the memory of a disturbance, but the awareness it had awakened. And in that awareness, carried quietly into the hours that followed, the true significance of the knock remained, not as an event to be solved, but as an experience to be felt, one that lingered softly at the edge of thought, like an echo that never fully fades. There were also nights when the knock seemed to arrive as if it belonged to the silence itself, not breaking it, but emerging from it so seamlessly that for a brief moment it felt like a natural extension of the quiet rather than an interruption. And this blending could make it harder to react immediately, because the mind hesitated, trying to decide whether anything had truly changed at all. In that hesitation, the awareness of the sound deepened, spreading slowly through thought, rather than striking it sharply. And this slower realization could make the moment feel more immersive, more enveloping, as though the night had gently shifted rather than been disturbed. At times, the knock would feel almost weightless, not in its sound but in its presence, as though it carried no urgency, no demand, simply existing as a signal without pressure. And this absence of force could be just as powerful as any insistence, because it left the entire burden of meaning on those who heard it. Without clear intent, the mind was free to interpret, to imagine, to question, and in that openness, the experience expanded, becoming less about the act, There were also nights when the knock seemed to arrive with a quiet sense of distance, as though it had travelled through layers of stillness before reaching the door, carrying with it a faint echo of the world beyond. And this sense of distance could make it feel less immediate, yet somehow more mysterious, as if it belonged not just to the doorstep, but to something farther away, something that had briefly touched the boundary before withdrawing again into the unseen. In that moment, the knock felt like a fragment of a larger reality, one that remained mostly hidden, revealing itself only through that single contained sound. At times, the knock might seem to settle into the space after it occurred, not disappearing completely, but lingering in a subtle way, as though it had left behind a quiet presence that could still be felt even without being heard. This lingering could create a sense that the moment was not entirely over, that something of it remained suspended in the air, waiting, and this feeling could shape how the silence that followed was experienced, turning it into something more attentive, more aware, as if the night itself were listening. There were also instances when the knock would feel almost reflective, as though it mirrored something within the listener, not in any direct way, but in the sense that it drew attention inward, prompting a quiet awareness of one's own thoughts, one's own presence in the stillness of the night. In this way, the sound became a point of focus, not just on what lay outside, but on what existed within, creating a moment that was both external and internal at once. In certain moments, the act of recognizing the knock became as significant as the knock itself. The transition from not knowing to knowing that something had occurred, marking a shift in awareness that could not easily be undone. Before the knock, the night was simply the night after it. The night carried an added layer of meaning, a subtle tension that remained even in silence, a quiet reminder that the boundary between inside and outside had been briefly acknowledged. There were also nights when the knock seemed to dissolve into the broader rhythm of time, becoming part of the continuous flow of moments, rather than standing apart from it. And in these cases, its significance might not be fully realized until later, when it was recalled, when it was placed into memory and considered from a distance. In that reflection, the simplicity of the event could give way to a deeper understanding of how it had been experienced, how it had shaped perception in ways that were not immediately apparent. Sometimes, the presence beyond the door would remain entirely undefined, not forming into any clear image or idea, and this absence of definition could be its own kind of presence, one that was open, expansive, and difficult to contain within any single interpretation. This openness allowed the experience to remain fluid, to shift in meaning depending on how it was remembered, how it was thought about, how it was felt in the quiet moments that followed. And as the night moved forward, carrying the household slowly back into its usual rhythm, there would remain a faint trace of that interruption, a subtle awareness that something had touched the boundary of their world and then receded, leaving behind only the memory of its presence. This trace, though small, could linger in thought, influencing how the next silence was heard, how the next sound was interpreted, creating a continuity between moments that might otherwise seem separate. So the knock, though brief and simple, became part of a larger experience, one that extended beyond the instant in which it occurred, and into the quiet unfolding of awareness that followed. It was not just a sound against a door, but a moment that revealed the delicate balance between the known and the unknown, between what was inside and what lay beyond, And in that revelation, it carried a quiet significance that remained long after the night had returned to stillness, echoing softly in memory as a reminder of how even the smallest events could open the door to something far deeper than they first appeared. There were also nights when the knock seemed to arrive as if it had always been waiting there, as though the moment itself had simply caught up to it. And this strange sense of inevitability could make it feel less like an interruption and more like a quiet fulfillment of something unseen, something that had been building beyond awareness until it finally revealed itself in that single contained sound. Inside, this feeling could create a pause that was not just about reacting, but about recognizing, as if the knock had entered not only the space of the house, but the flow of thought itself. At times, the knock might seem to carry a kind of stillness within it, a calm that contrasted with the tension it created, and this contrast could make the experience feel more complex, less defined by fear alone, and more by a quiet attentiveness, as though the moment invited observation rather than immediate action. In that calm there was space to listen more deeply, to notice not just the sound but everything around it. The silence before, the silence after, the subtle shifts in awareness that accompanied it. There were also instances when the knock would feel almost like a boundary being acknowledged from both sides, not just an attempt to cross from outside to inside, but a recognition that the boundary existed at all, that there was a separation between two spaces that could be touched but not necessarily broken. This mutual acknowledgement, though silent and unspoken, could give the moment a different tone, one that was less about intrusion and more about contact, a brief connection that did not require resolution to have meaning. In certain moments, the act of holding that awareness, of staying present with the uncertainty rather than resolving it, became the central experience, turning the knock into something that unfolded within time rather than ending with it. The longer the awareness was held, the more the moment seemed to expand, revealing layers of perception that might otherwise have gone unnoticed, making the experience feel deeper, more textured, more reflective. There were also nights when the knock would seem to fade not into silence, but into thought, becoming something that continued to exist in the mind even after it could no longer be heard, replaying softly, shifting slightly with each recollection, taking on new meaning each time it was considered. This movement from sound to memory gave the experience a kind of continuity, allowing it to extend beyond its physical duration and into the ongoing process of reflection. Sometimes the presence beyond the door would remain entirely unresolved, not because it lacked meaning, but because its meaning was not fixed, not confined to a single interpretation. And this openness could be what gave the moment its lasting quality, allowing it to remain alive in thought, to be revisited, reconsidered, experienced again in different ways over time. And as the night continued, slowly returning to its familiar rhythm, there would remain a quiet awareness that something had shifted, however subtly, in the way the space was felt, the way the silence was heard, the way the boundary was understood. The knock, though brief, had altered perception, had drawn attention to something that usually remained unnoticed, and in doing so, had left behind a trace that lingered gently, shaping the experience of the night long after the sound itself had disappeared. So in the end, the knock was not defined by what it revealed, but by what it opened. An awareness of uncertainty, a moment of quiet attention, a space where the ordinary became something more, something layered, something meaningful. And in that opening, carried softly into memory, the true essence of the experience remained, not as a single event, but as a subtle and enduring presence, echoing quietly at the edge of thought, like a sound that never fully fades. There were also nights when the knock seemed to arrive with a strange softness that made it almost feel like a memory, rather than a present event, as if it belonged to something already past, rather than something happening now. And this subtle disconnection from the immediate moment could make it harder to respond, because the mind hesitated, unsure whether to treat it as something real or something recalled. In that hesitation, the experience stretched, becoming less about urgency and more about awareness, a quiet recognition that something had touched the boundary between inside and outside without fully crossing it. At times, the knock might feel as though it carried no clear direction, not entirely from the outside, nor entirely separate from the space within, but existing somewhere in between, in that thin layer where perception meets reality. And this ambiguity could create a sense that the boundary itself had become less defined, more permeable, allowing the experience to feel less contained, more expansive. In such moments, the door was no longer just a barrier, but a point of overlap, a place where two different states of being briefly met. There were also instances when the knock would seem to align with a deeper quiet in the surroundings, not standing out sharply but settling gently into the existing stillness. And this integration could make it feel less like an interruption and more like a continuation, as though the night itself had produced the sound rather than something external to it. This perception could soften the tension, turning it into something more contemplative, though no less mysterious. In certain moments, the awareness of the knock would unfold gradually, not all at once, as if the mind needed time to fully register what had happened, and this gradual unfolding could create a layered experience. There were also nights when the knock seemed to arrive as if it had no beginning, as though it simply emerged into awareness already complete, without any sense of approach or preparation. And this lack of origin could make it feel more mysterious, more difficult to place within the ordinary flow of events. It did not feel like something that had travelled toward the door, but something that had simply appeared at it, and this sudden presence could create a quiet disorientation, a moment where the mind searched for context and found none, leaving the experience suspended in a kind of uncertainty that resisted easy explanation. At times, the knock might feel as though it carried a quiet balance, neither inviting nor threatening, neither urgent nor dismissive, but existing in a neutral space that allowed it to be interpreted in many different ways at once. And this neutrality could make the experience more open, more expansive, because it did not push the listener toward a single reaction. Instead, it allowed the mind to explore possibilities freely, to move between caution and curiosity without settling firmly into either, creating a moment that was defined not by action, but by awareness. There were also instances when the knock seemed to shift slightly in memory, even as it was being remembered. Its tone, its timing, its presence changing just enough to make each recollection feel a little different from the last. And this fluidity could give it a quality that felt almost alive, as though it were not fixed in the past, but continuing to evolve in thought. This made the experience less about a single stable event, and more about an ongoing interaction between memory and perception. In certain moments, The act of holding the memory of the knock became a quiet form of engagement, a way of revisiting the boundary it had touched without needing to physically return to it. And this internal engagement could be just as vivid as the original experience, allowing the moment to be explored from different angles, each revealing something new about how it had been perceived, how it had been understood. There were also nights when the knock seemed to dissolve almost immediately into the surrounding stillness, leaving behind only the faintest trace, as if it had never fully taken shape. And this fleeting quality could make it feel almost unreal, like something that had slipped through the edges of perception rather than firmly entering it. Yet even in its subtlety, it left a mark, a quiet awareness that something had occurred, however briefly, however lightly. Sometimes the presence beyond the door would be imagined not as something waiting to be discovered, but as something that did not require discovery at all, something that existed independently of whether it was acknowledged. And this perspective could shift the experience away from action entirely, turning it into a moment of quiet coexistence rather than confrontation, where the inside and the outside simply existed alongside one another, connected only by the brief contact of the knock. And as the night continued, moving slowly forward, carrying with it the memory of that brief encounter, there would remain a subtle change in how the silence was felt, a slight deepening, a quiet richness that had not been there before, as though the moment had added something intangible to the space, something that could not be seen or heard but could still be sensed. This added depth lingered softly, shaping the experience of the night in ways that were gentle but lasting. So the knock, in all its simplicity, became something that extended beyond the limits of sound and time, touching on the ways in which moments are perceived, remembered, and carried forward. It was not just an event, but an experience that unfolded within awareness itself, revealing how even the smallest interruption could open a space for reflection, for interpretation, for quiet attention. And in that space, held briefly yet meaningfully, the knock found its true presence. Not as something that demanded an answer, but as something that invited awareness, leaving behind an echo that remained long after the night had settled once more into silence. There were also nights when the knock seemed to arrive as if it belonged to a moment that had already passed, carrying with it a faint sense of delay, as though it had travelled through time as well as space before reaching the door. And this subtle feeling of lateness could make it seem disconnected from the present, like an echo of something that had already happened elsewhere. In that sense, the knock felt less like an immediate event, and more like a trace, something that had crossed a distance, not just in place, but in experience, arriving slightly out of alignment with the now. At times, the knock might feel as though it existed at the edge of awareness, not fully entering attention all at once, but lingering just outside it, requiring a moment of recognition before it could be fully understood. And this delay in perception could give the experience a layered quality, where the realization unfolded gradually rather than instantly. The mind would catch up to the sound, piece by piece, until it settled into clarity. And in that process, the moment seemed to deepen, expanding beyond the instant in which it occurred. There were also instances when the knock seemed to carry a kind of quiet completeness, as though it did not need to be followed by anything else to have meaning. And this self-contained nature could make it feel more like a statement than a request, something that simply existed without expectation, leaving those who heard it to decide what, if anything, should come next. This absence of demand created a space of freedom, but also of responsibility, because it placed the entire weight of interpretation on the listener. In certain moments, the act of remembering the knock could feel as vivid as the experience itself, as though the memory retained not just the sound but the atmosphere, the stillness, the subtle tension that surrounded it. And this vividness could make the past feel present again, allowing the moment to be revisited with a clarity that blurred the boundary between then and now. Each recollection became a kind of return, not to the event itself, but to the awareness it had created. There were also nights when the knock seemed to dissolve into the surrounding quiet in such a way that it left behind a kind of openness, a space where something had been and was now absent. And this absence could feel almost tangible, like a shape defined by what was no longer there. This sense of absence gave the silence a different quality, making it feel less empty and more like a continuation of the moment, as though the knock had not ended but simply changed form. Sometimes the presence beyond the door would be imagined not as something fixed or waiting, but as something that had already moved on, leaving behind only the trace of its contact. And this idea could shift the focus away from what might happen next, and toward what had already occurred, turning the experience into something reflective rather than anticipatory. And as the night carried on, slowly returning to its familiar rhythm, the memory of the knock would settle into a quieter place within thought, no longer immediate but still present, like a faint echo that could be heard only when attention turned toward it. This echo, though soft, remained steady, a reminder of how even the smallest moment could leave behind a lasting impression. So the knock, simple in form yet expansive in meaning, became more than just a sound in the night. It became a point of awareness, a moment where perception deepened and the boundary between inside and outside was briefly illuminated. And in that brief illumination, something subtle yet lasting was revealed. Not about what lay beyond the door, but about how such moments are experienced, remembered, and carried forward, echoing quietly through time long after the night itself has passed. There were also nights when the knock seemed to arrive with a kind of quiet inevitability that made it feel as though it had always been part of the night, waiting for the exact moment to become audible. And this sense of hidden presence could make the experience feel deeper, as if the sound was not an intrusion, but a revelation of something that had already existed just beyond awareness. Inside, this could create a subtle shift in perception, where the focus moved from reacting to the knock to understanding it as part of a larger stillness that had briefly made itself known. At times, the knock might feel as though it carried a boundary within it, not just touching the door, but defining the space between inside and outside in a more vivid way, making that division suddenly clear, almost tangible. In that instant, the door was no longer just an object, but a line, a point of separation that could be crossed or maintained, and the awareness of that choice gave the moment its weight, turning a simple sound into something that held both possibility and consequence. There were also instances when the knock seemed to linger not in the air but in attention, drawing the mind back to it again and again, as though it had created a focal point that refused to dissolve completely. Even as other thoughts tried to move forward, they would circle back, returning to the sound, to the moment, to the question it had introduced, and this quiet persistence could make the experience feel ongoing, extending far beyond the brief instant in which it had occurred. In certain moments, the act of listening became almost reflective of the knock itself, a gentle repetition of attention, where the mind mirrored the rhythm of the sound by returning to it, again and again, without resolution. This mirroring created a subtle connection between the listener and the event. There were also nights when the knock seemed to arrive as though it belonged to no clear moment at all, neither fully part of the present nor entirely separate from it, but suspended in a kind of quiet in between, where time itself felt softened, less defined, and in that softened state the sound could feel more expansive, as if it carried more than just its physical presence. It did not simply happen and end. It unfolded, lingering gently in awareness, as though it had no urgency to resolve, allowing the mind to remain with it, rather than move past it. At times, the knock might feel as though it revealed something about the silence itself, not just interrupting it, but showing its depth, its texture, its subtle variations that might otherwise go unnoticed. In that moment, the quiet was no longer empty but full, layered with attention, and the knock became a way of perceiving that fullness, a brief illumination of what had always been there, but had not been fully seen. There were also instances when the knock seemed to carry a quiet stillness within it, not just surrounding it, but contained in it, as if the sound itself held a pause, a moment of rest that extended outward into the space around it. This quality could make the experience feel less like movement and more like presence, something that existed without needing to progress or change, something that simply was. In certain moments, the awareness of the knock could feel almost circular, returning to itself, as though the mind revisited it not to resolve it, but to remain with it, to experience it again from slightly different angles, each time revealing something new, something subtle that had not been noticed before. This circular attention gave the moment a kind of continuity, allowing it to exist beyond its original occurrence. There were also nights when the knock seemed to dissolve into a kind of quiet clarity, leaving behind not tension or uncertainty, but a simple awareness, a recognition that something had been perceived, something had been acknowledged, and that this acknowledgement was enough in itself, requiring no further action. In this way, the experience became complete without resolution, whole without explanation. Sometimes the presence beyond the door would be imagined not as something separate, but as part of the same world, the same stillness, simply positioned differently, and this perspective could soften the boundary between inside and outside, making it feel less like a division and more like a gentle distinction. And as the night continued, carrying everything slowly forward, the memory of the knock would remain not as a disturbance, but as a quiet addition, something that had deepened the experience of the night rather than broken it, something that had revealed rather than disrupted. This subtle shift in perception could linger, influencing how future moments were experienced, how silence was heard, how attention was held. So the knock, though brief and simple, became something that extended into the very way the night was perceived, a moment that opened awareness rather than demanded action, that revealed depth rather than introduced disruption. And in that gentle unfolding, where sound met silence and awareness met presence, the knock found its lasting meaning, not in what it changed, but in what it revealed, leaving behind a quiet echo that continued not as sound, but as understanding. There were also nights when the knock seemed to arrive with a kind of quiet transparency, as though it did not hide anything yet, revealed nothing specific either, existing in a space where it could be fully heard but never fully understood. And this clarity without explanation could make the experience feel strangely open, as if it invited attention without directing it. In that openness, the mind was free to remain with the sound, to explore it without needing to define it. And this freedom could turn the moment into something less about reaction and more about presence. At times, the knock might feel as though it echoed, not outward, but inward, resonating within awareness itself, rather than in the space around it. And this inward echo could make the experience feel deeply personal, as if the boundary it touched was not just the door, but the edge of perception. In that sense, the knock became less about what lay beyond, and more about what was felt within, a quiet reflection of attention turning toward itself. There were also instances when the knock seemed to hold a kind of stillness that extended beyond its duration, as though the moment it created did not end when the sound faded, but continued gently in the silence that followed, shaping how that silence was experienced. This continuation gave the moment a sense of depth, allowing it to unfold gradually rather than disappear abruptly, and in that unfolding, the experience felt more complete, more integrated into the flow of the night. In certain moments, the act of perceiving the knock became as significant as the knock itself, the awareness of hearing it marking a shift that could not be undone, a movement from unknowing to knowing that changed how everything afterward was felt. Before the knock, there was only quiet. After it, there was a quiet that had been touched, a silence that carried memory within it. There were also nights when the knock seemed to dissolve into a kind of gentle uncertainty, not creating tension, but a soft openness, a space where multiple possibilities could exist without needing to be resolved. And this openness could feel almost calming, as though the absence of certainty allowed for a different kind of experience, one that was not driven by the need to decide or act. Sometimes the presence beyond the door would be imagined not as something approaching or waiting, but simply as something that had briefly connected, touched the boundary, and then withdrawn, leaving behind only the awareness of that contact. And this perspective could make the moment feel less like an encounter and more like a passing interaction, something that had occurred without requiring continuation. And as the night carried on, slowly returning to its quiet rhythm, the knock would remain as a subtle shift in awareness, a quiet reminder that even in stillness, something can arise, be noticed, and fade, leaving behind a trace that gently shapes how the stillness is experienced afterward. This trace, though light, could persist, influencing how future moments were perceived, adding a quiet depth to the experience of silence itself. So the knock, simple and fleeting, became something that extended beyond its physical form, touching on the way awareness unfolds, how moments are noticed, how they are held, and how they fade. It was not just a sound at a door, but a moment of connection between perception and presence, a brief opening in the flow of the night where something revealed itself and then disappeared again, leaving behind not an answer, but a quiet, lasting awareness that continued softly, like an echo that exists not in sound, but in attention. There were also nights when the knock seemed to arrive with a kind of quiet weightlessness, as though it did not press upon the moment, but simply rested within it, neither demanding attention nor fading away, existing in a delicate balance that allowed it to be noticed without overwhelming the stillness. In that balance, the experience could feel almost suspended, as if the night itself had paused just enough to hold the sound gently before letting it dissolve again into silence. At times, the knock might feel as though it revealed the subtle boundaries of awareness itself, not just the physical boundary of the door, but the edge where perception meets the unknown, and this realization could give the moment a deeper quality, one that extended beyond the immediate event into a quiet understanding of how experience unfolds. The knock, in this sense, became less about what was happening, and more about how it was being noticed. There were also instances when the knock seemed to echo in a way that did not repeat the sound, but the feeling, a quiet resonance that lingered within the space of attention, creating a soft continuity between the moment of hearing and the moments that followed. This resonance could make the experience feel ongoing, not because anything new was happening, but because the awareness of what had happened remained present. In certain moments, the silence after the knock felt as though it had been shaped by it, not broken or disturbed, but subtly altered, as if the sound had passed through it and left behind a different texture, a different quality that could be sensed even without being defined. This altered silence carried the memory of the knock within it, making the quiet feel richer, more layered, more alive. There were also nights when the knock seemed to carry no intention at all, not as a request, not as a signal, but simply as an occurrence, something that happened without needing to mean anything beyond itself. And this absence of intention could make the experience feel more open, less bound by interpretation, allowing it to exist as it was without needing to be understood. Sometimes, the presence beyond the door would be imagined not as something separate from the listener, but as part of the same unfolding moment, connected through the shared experience of time and space. And this perspective could soften the sense of division, making the boundary feel less like a barrier and more like a point of relation, a place where two aspects of the same world briefly touched. And as the night continued, carrying the experience gently forward, the knock would remain not as a distinct memory, but as a subtle influence, a quiet shift in how attention moved, how silence was felt, how presence was understood. It would not stand out sharply, but it would not disappear.